The Red Smoke Gang thought they were about to rob a frail old man, but they had no idea the legend they were crossing. In a small, dusty town where lawlessness reigned and justice seemed like a distant memory, one man's quiet existence was about to shake the very foundations of what people believed possible. Before we dive in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if you love stories of justice, make sure to subscribe because we've got more tales you won't want to miss. The evening sun cast long shadows across the weathered porch of Lucas Stanton's modest homestead. His calloused hands, marked by years of untold stories, methodically cleaned an old brass compass, a ritual he'd performed countless times before. At first glance, most folks saw nothing remarkable about the elderly man who lived on the outskirts of Millbrook. His silver hair and measured movements spoke of age, while his worn clothes and simple lifestyle suggested nothing more than a quiet settler living out his twilight years. But there was something in his eyes, a depth that hinted at experiences few could comprehend. When he walked through town, his posture remained straight despite his years, his gaze always alert, yet never anxious. He spoke little, smiled less, but treated everyone with a quiet dignity that had earned him, if not friendship, then at least respect. These days, respect is a rare commodity in Millbrook. The Red Smoke Gang had seen to that. Under the leadership of Cyrus "Red" McGraw, they'd turned the once peaceful territory into their personal hunting ground. Their name came from the red smoke signals they'd send up before attacking a settlement, a calling card that struck terror into the hearts of honest folk for 50 miles around. Sheriff Tom Baker, a good man with a tin star and too few deputies, watched helplessly as the gang's influence grew. They started small, a stolen horse here, a ransacked store there. But like cancer, their presence spread. Soon they were demanding protection money from every business in town, burning down any establishment that dared refuse. "Ain't much we can do," Baker confided to the saloon keeper one evening, his voice heavy with defeat. "They've got 30 men, maybe more. We've got 3 deputies and a jail that couldn't hold half of them if we did manage to make arrests." The townsfolk had started to lose hope. They kept their heads down, paid what they had to, and prayed the gang's attention would fall elsewhere. But fate had other plans, and in Lucas Stanton's quiet home, decades of buried history were about to resurface. Because sometimes, the most dangerous man is the one you least suspect. The day the Red Smoke Gang stormed into Millbrook, the air was thick with tension. Their horses' hooves thundered down Main Street, kicking up clouds of dust that seemed to announce their arrival like a looming storm. Cyrus McGraw led the charge, his red bandana bright as blood against the dull browns of the town. Mrs. Henderson's general store was their first target. The elderly shopkeeper had fallen behind on her payments, and McGraw was there to make an example of her. He swaggered through the door, flanked by 2 of his most brutal enforcers, while the rest of the gang spread out to terrorize other businesses. "Payment due, Mrs. Henderson," McGraw drawled, his voice carrying the false sweetness of a rattler's warning. "Plus interest in making us ride all the way out here to collect." Mrs. Henderson's hands trembled as she counted out her meager savings. "Please, Mr. McGraw, business has been slow. This is all I have." McGraw's smile vanished. With a sudden sweep of his arm, he sent goods crashing from the nearest shelf. "All you have ain't enough. Maybe we ought to help ourselves to some merchandise to make up the difference." His men started ransacking the store, tossing supplies into sacks, while Mrs. Henderson watched helplessly, tears streaming down her weathered face. That's when the bell above the door chimed softly. Lucas Stanton stood in the doorway, his presence somehow filling the small space despite his unassuming stature. He carried a simple walking stick and wore the same worn jacket he always did, but something in his bearing made McGraw's men pause. "That's enough," Lucas said quietly, his voice steady as stone. "The lady paid what she could. Time for you to leave." McGraw turned slowly, amusement dancing in his cruel eyes. "Well, well. Looks like we got ourselves a hero." He stepped closer to Lucas, using his height to loom over the older man. "You got any idea who you're talking to, old-timer?" "I know exactly who you are," Lucas replied, meeting McGraw's gaze without flinching. Question is, do you know who you're threatening? For a moment, something flickered across McGraw's face. Uncertainty, perhaps, or a primitive recognition of danger. But it passed quickly, replaced by arrogant rage. "Boys," McGraw called out, "seems like this old fool needs a lesson in respect." But before his men could move, Lucas's walking stick shot out, lightning fast, catching one thug's wrist mid-reach. The crack of bone was audible in the sudden silence. "Last warning," Lucas said, his voice unchanged despite the violence of his action. "Walk away." McGraw's face darkened with fury, but he raised a hand to stop his other man from attacking. "You just made a big mistake, old man. We'll be back, and when we are, you'll wish you'd minded your own business." As the gang retreated, their threats echoing down the street, Lucas turned to Mrs. Henderson. "You all right, ma'am?" But when they came back, they wouldn't be facing a harmless old man. Word of Lucas Stanton's defiance spread through Millbrook like wildfire. In the saloon, at the general store, and around dinner tables, people whispered about the old man who dared to stand up to the Red Smoke gang. Some called him brave, others foolish, but everyone wondered about the mysterious stranger who'd lived among them so quietly for years. "Did you see how fast he moved?" Tommy Wilson, the blacksmith's apprentice, asked anyone who'd listen. "That walking stick was just a blur, and the way he broke Jake Miller's wrist, I ain't never seen nothing like it." Sarah Miller, who ran the boarding house, had her own thoughts to share. "Always knew there was something different about Mr. Stanton. Way he carries himself, how he's always watching. That ain't the manner of no ordinary settler." Sheriff Baker listened to these stories with growing concern. As the town's lawman, he couldn't ignore the situation brewing. The Red Smoke gang wouldn't let this challenge go unanswered, and whatever storm was coming would affect everyone in Millbrook. That evening, he rode out to Lucas's homestead. The old man was sitting on his porch, whittling a piece of wood with the same walking stick he'd used earlier. He didn't look up as Baker approached, though the sheriff knew he'd been spotted long before he reached the house. "Evening, Lucas," Baker called out, dismounting. "Reckon we need to talk about what happened today." Lucas set aside his whittling and gestured to the empty chair beside him. "Suppose we do, Tom." Baker settled into the chair, studying the man beside him. "You know they'll come back. McGraw's got a reputation to maintain. He can't let someone stand up to him like that. Especially not—" He trailed off, uncomfortable. "Especially not an old man," Lucas finished, a hint of amusement in his voice. "Tell me, Sheriff, you ever wonder why I chose this spot for my home?" Baker glanced around. The house sat on a slight rise, with clear views in all directions. The barn and other outbuildings were positioned strategically, creating natural channels of approach. "Starting to," Baker admitted. "Who are you, really, Lucas?" Lucas was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. "Served in the war between the states, Confederate artillery. Learned things about trajectories, about how to make the ground work for you." He paused, running his hand along the walking stick. "Learned things about men, too, about fear and courage, and how thin the line is between them." Baker felt a chill despite the evening warmth. "Artillery, you say?" Lucas nodded but offered nothing more, leaving the sheriff to wonder just what other secrets this quiet man held. "Because legends aren't born," Lucas said softly, almost to himself. "They're made in fire and thunder." Baker left that evening with more questions than answers, but one thing was certain. Lucas Stanton was far more than he appeared, and the Red Smoke Gang had no idea what they'd stirred up. The Red Smoke Gang's retaliation came 3 nights later, announced by the crackling of flames and the acrid smell of burning wood. Lucas awoke to find his barn ablaze, the orange glow casting dancing shadows across his property, while hooded figures circled on horseback, whooping and firing shots into the air. "Let's see how brave you are now, old man," McGraw's voice carried over the chaos. "Next time, it'll be your house, with you in it." But as the gang members celebrated their act of destruction, they failed to notice something peculiar. Lucas hadn't rushed out in panic. He hadn't fired blindly into the night or shouted threats of his own. Instead, he stood calmly at his window, watching the barn burn with an expression that held not fear, but calculation. Only when the gang's hoofbeats faded into the distance did Lucas move. He walked to the far corner of his bedroom and knelt before an old trunk he hadn't opened in years. The key hung around his neck, worn smooth by decades of contact with his skin. The trunk's hinges creaked in protest as he lifted the lid. Inside lay the carefully preserved remnants of another life. A weathered gray uniform with artillery insignia, positioning tools that hadn't seen use since Appomattox, and a collection of medals he'd never displayed. But it was the items beneath these that truly mattered. Tucked away in oiled cloth were the tools of his true expertise. Specialized implements for calculating range and trajectory, precision instruments for measuring powder charges, and detailed notebooks filled with calculations and formulas that had once rained death upon advancing Union lines. Lucas ran his fingers over these artifacts of his past, memories flooding back. The thunder of guns, the precise choreography of well-trained crews, the mathematics of destruction that had made him legendary among Confederate artillery commanders. He'd sworn never to use this knowledge again and had tried to leave that life behind. "Times change," he murmured, carefully removing each item from the trunk. "Sometimes the past needs to speak again." Working through the night, Lucas began preparing. He dragged heavy furniture into strategic positions, reinforcing windows and creating firing positions that weren't immediately visible from outside. In his cellar, he uncovered carefully preserved powder kegs and projectiles, not the massive shells of his war days, but smaller ammunition he'd adapted for a different purpose. By dawn, the smoking ruins of his barn had become part of a larger plan. The destruction had actually opened up clear fields of fire he hadn't had before. Every approach to his house was now covered, every potential piece of cover noted and ranged. "They want a war?" Lucas said softly, making final adjustments to equipment that hadn't seen use in decades. "I'll give them one." But this fight wouldn't be fought with bullets alone. It would be fought with the precision and terrible mathematics that had once made Lucas Stanton one of the most feared artillery officers in the Confederate Army. Word of the barn burning spread quickly through Millbrook, sending ripples of fear through the community. That morning, as smoke still rose from Lucas's property, the town council gathered in an emergency meeting at the courthouse. The air was thick with tension as voices rose in heated debate. "We can't just stand by and watch them burn people out," declared Marcus Thompson, the town banker, pounding his fist on the table. "Today it's Stanton's barn. Tomorrow it could be any of our homes." But Samuel Webb, who owned the general store, shook his head nervously. "And what would you have us do? Take on the whole Red Smoke gang? That's suicide, pure and simple. Maybe if we all chip in, pay Stanton's protection money, they'll leave him be." The debate raged on, splitting the town between those who wanted to stand with Lucas and those who feared the consequences of defiance. Sheriff Baker stood at the window, watching the townspeople go about their business while this crucial decision was debated above them. "We need to think about this carefully," Baker finally said, turning to face the council. "Lucas Stanton isn't just some helpless old man. There's more to him than meets the eye." "What do you mean, Sheriff?" Martha Reeves, the schoolteacher, asked. Before Baker could respond, the courthouse door opened and Lucas himself walked in. The room fell silent as he made his way to the front, his walking stick tapping softly against the wooden floor. "I hear you're discussing my problem," Lucas said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "But it's not just my problem anymore. The Red Smoke Gang won't stop with my barn. They can't afford to, not now." "Then what do you suggest?" Webb demanded. "That we all die protecting your pride?" Lucas's eyes fixed on Webb, and something in that gaze made the store owner step back. "I suggest you let me handle this. I won't ask any of you to fight, but I won't back down either." "Mr. Stanton," Baker interjected, "they'll come back with everything they have. You can't face them alone." A slight smile crossed Lucas's weathered face. "Sheriff, I've faced worse odds than this. Much worse. They think they're dealing with a stubborn old man, Let them think that. But know this, I won't let them terrorize this town any longer." As he turned to leave, Lucas paused at the door. "They want a war?" he said, almost to himself. "I'll give them one they'll never forget." The room remained silent after he left, his words hanging in the air like smoke. Baker watched through the window as Lucas made his way back down the street, noting how people unconsciously moved aside, sensing something dangerous in his steady stride. And when the smoke cleared, they'd know exactly who Lucas Stanton really was. Under the cover of darkness, Lucas transformed his property into a fortress. Years of military experience guided his hands as he worked, turning the seemingly simple homestead into a carefully planned killing ground. But his true masterpiece lay hidden in the storm cellar, where an old friend waited to sing its deadly song once more. The small brass cannon, barely 4 feet long, had been his constant companion during the war. He'd smuggled it home piece by piece, unable to part with the weapon that had saved his life countless times. Now, as he cleaned and reassembled it, muscle memory took over. Every component slid perfectly into place, as if the decades since its last use had never passed. "Hello, old friend," he murmured, running his hand along the barrel. The metal was cold beneath his touch, but it felt alive somehow, eager to prove it hadn't lost its bite. Lucas had spent days preparing the ground. What looked like random debris and damaged furniture from the barn fire was actually carefully positioned cover, creating natural channels that would force attackers exactly where he wanted them. He'd calculated every range, marked every reference point, and prepared multiple firing positions. The cannon itself was mounted on a specially designed rotating platform, allowing it to be quickly repositioned to cover different approaches. Lucas had modified it to fire smaller charges, less powerful than its wartime ammunition, but more than adequate for his current needs. "They'll come at dawn," he said to himself, making final adjustments. "They always do, thinking the light will blind me, thinking they'll catch me sleeping." Throughout the night, he continued his preparations. Powder charges were carefully measured and stored in waterproof containers. Makeshift grape shot was positioned near each firing point. Signal wires were strung between positions, allowing him to coordinate his movements even when under fire. As the eastern sky began to lighten, Lucas heard the first distant hoofbeats. He moved to his observation point, using skills honed by years of war to gauge their numbers by sound alone. More than before, much more. McGraw wasn't taking any chances this time. The first rays of sunlight revealed mounted figures gathering just beyond rifle range. Lucas counted at least 30 riders, with more arriving. They formed a rough semicircle around his property, their confidence evident in their casual poses and loud voices. "Last chance, old man," McGraw's voice carried clearly across the morning air. "Come out now, apologize properly, and maybe we'll let you live." Lucas made his final preparations, checking sight lines and adjusting his position slightly. Everything was ready, all his calculations, all his experience, all focused on this moment. "They think they're laying siege to an old man's cabin," he muttered, a grim smile crossing his face. "But they're standing on my battlefield now." Through his sight glass, he could see McGraw growing impatient, gesturing for his men to move forward. But they didn't know. They couldn't know, but they didn't know. They were standing on his battlefield. The first shot caught the Red Smoke gang completely by surprise. One moment, they were advancing confidently toward what they thought was an old man's helpless stand. The next, the ground in front of their lead riders erupted in a blast of dirt and grape shot, sending horses rearing and men diving for cover. "Artillery!" someone screamed, the word carrying a note of disbelief. Before they could recover, a second shot boomed across the property, this one taking out the large oak tree they'd been using as a rallying point. Wood splinters flew in all directions as the trunk split apart, forcing several riders to abandon their positions. McGraw's voice rose above the chaos. "It's just one old man. Spread out and rush him from all sides." But Lucas had anticipated this. As the gang members split into smaller groups, they found themselves channeled by the seemingly random debris and wreckage into predetermined killing zones. The cannon spoke again and again, each shot precisely calculated, each blast driving them exactly where Lucas wanted them. "Impossible!" McGraw raged, watching his carefully planned assault dissolve into confusion. "Nobody can reload that fast!" But Lucas had spent decades perfecting his techniques. His movements were economical, practiced, each motion flowing smoothly into the next. The small cannon's recoil was managed by an ingenious system of ropes and counterweights, allowing him to maintain accuracy while firing at a pace that seemed supernatural to his attackers. When groups of riders tried to charge through the smoke, they found themselves caught in a devastating crossfire. Lucas had positioned loaded rifles at key points throughout his defenses, allowing him to maintain a steady barrage, even while operating the cannon. Every time the gang thought they'd found a safe approach, another explosion would force them back. "He's everywhere!" one of McGraw's lieutenants shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "How can he be everywhere?" The morning air grew thick with smoke, adding to the gang's confusion. They'd come expecting to overwhelm one old man with superior numbers. Instead, they found themselves facing an invisible enemy who seemed to predict their every move, who turned their own tactics against them with terrifying precision. Lucas worked with mechanical efficiency, his mind clear and focused. Each shot was carefully plotted, each blast designed not just to kill but to demoralize. He used the smoke to his advantage, creating the illusion of multiple defenders, making his one cannon sound like a battery of guns. "Fall back!" McGraw finally ordered, his composure cracking as another blast took out 3 of his men. "Regroup at the ridge." But Lucas had ranged that position too. As the gang retreated toward what they thought was safety, one final shot screamed over their heads, exploding just beyond the ridge and showing them nowhere was secure. A primal fear began to spread through the Red Smoke gang. This wasn't just a fight. It was a demonstration of power they couldn't comprehend. But Lucas had one last surprise up his sleeve. The morning sun hung high in the smoke-filled sky as the battle reached its climax. McGraw, his face twisted with rage and disbelief, had finally had enough. Leaving his men cowering behind what little cover remained, he spurred his horse forward, determined to face this mysterious opponent himself. "Come out and face me like a man, Stanton!" he roared, drawing both his pistols. "No more tricks! No more hiding behind your cannon!" The property fell silent, the echoes of the last artillery blast fading into an eerie calm. Then, from the swirling smoke, Lucas emerged. He walked with the same measured pace he always had, his walking stick tap-tapping against the ground. But now there was no mistaking the soldier's bearing in his stance. "Hiding?" Lucas's voice carried clearly across the yard. "I haven't been hiding, McGraw. I've been teaching you a lesson about the difference between terror and true warfare." McGraw fired both pistols, but Lucas moved with impossible speed for a man his age. The walking stick flashed up, deflecting one shot, while he seemed to simply step aside from the other. Before McGraw could react, Lucas had closed the distance between them. The gang leader found himself yanked from his saddle, hitting the ground hard as Lucas's walking stick swept his legs out from under him. His pistols went flying, and suddenly he was looking up at the old man who had single-handedly decimated his gang. "How?" McGraw gasped, scrambling backward. "You're just one old man!" Lucas's eyes hardened. "I'm not just an old man. I'm Artillery Commander Lucas Stanton, 3rd Virginia Regiment. I've faced armies, boy. I've planned battles that would make your little raids look like children's games, and I've spent decades perfecting every lesson I learned." McGraw lunged for a hidden knife, but Lucas was ready. The walking stick cracked across his wrist, sending the blade spinning away. A second strike caught him behind the knees, dropping him to the ground again. "You had a choice," Lucas continued, his voice never rising above its usual calm tone. "You could have been a decent man, could have built something instead of destroying, but you chose to prey on the weak, thinking that made you strong." The remaining gang members watched in stunned silence as their fearsome leader was systematically disarmed and humbled by an elderly man with a walking stick. Some began to slowly back their horses away, while others simply stared, transfixed by the scene. "Now you have another choice," Lucas said, looking not just at McGraw, but at all the survivors. "Leave this territory and never return, or find out what else I learned in the war." McGraw, his face bloody and his pride shattered, finally broke. "Ride out!" he screamed to his men. "Ride out now!" The Red Smoke gang scattered like leaves in a storm, leaving their wounded leader crawling in the dust of his own defeat. The dust hadn't fully settled when the townspeople began emerging from their homes. They came cautiously at first, then with growing confidence as they realized the Red Smoke gang was truly gone. The scene that greeted them was like something out of the war stories their parents had told. Scattered equipment, craters from artillery fire, and the lingering smell of gunpowder in the air. Sheriff Baker led a group of wide-eyed citizens toward Lucas's property, their boots crunching on spent shell casings and debris. The old soldier stood calmly in his yard, leaning on his walking stick as if he'd just finished tending his garden rather than routing a notorious gang. "My God, Lucas," Baker breathed, surveying the destruction. "I've never seen anything like it. You took on their whole gang by yourself." Lucas nodded slightly, his expression unchanged. "Had to be done, Tom. Sometimes you have to remind the wolves why they should fear men." Mrs. Henderson pushed through the crowd, tears streaming down her face. She approached Lucas and took his weathered hands in hers. "You saved us, Mr. Stanton. Not just me, but the whole town. We didn't deserve your protection after how some folks wanted to give in to those bandits, but you stood up for us anyway." "Everyone deserves protection, ma'am," Lucas replied softly. "That's what I learned in the war. Not about fighting, about defending those who can't defend themselves." The townspeople spread out across the property, marveling at Lucas's intricate defense system. Marcus Thompson, the banker, examined the small cannon with a mix of awe and respect. "This is what turned the tide?" he asked. "Seems almost too small to do such damage." Lucas ran his hand along the barrel. "It's not the size that matters. It's knowing how to use what you have. Knowledge, preparation, and the will to stand your ground. Those are what win battles." As the morning wore on, more details of the fight emerged. Riders reported seeing the remnants of the Red Smoke gang fleeing in all directions, their once-feared reputation shattered by an old artillery officer with a small cannon and an iron will. Sheriff Baker organized search parties to round up any wounded gang members left behind, while others began helping Lucas clear the debris from his property. The community that had been paralyzed by fear just days ago was now working together with renewed purpose. "You've done more than just run off a gang, Lucas," Baker observed, watching the townspeople work. "You've given these folks back their courage." Lucas nodded thoughtfully. "Fear's a funny thing, Sheriff. It can paralyze a whole town, making good people forget their strength. Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand up to remind them that they don't have to live in fear." But as the crowd continued to gather and more people came to thank him, Lucas knew this was just the beginning. The legend of what happened at his homestead would spread, and with it, the truth about the quiet old man who had turned a gang swagger into terror. As the sun began to set on that momentous day, Lucas invited Sheriff Baker and a few others into his home. The room was simple but meticulously organized, with a worn map of Virginia hanging on one wall and a small shelf of books on artillery tactics tucked discreetly in the corner. "I suppose you all deserve to know the truth," Lucas said, settling into his favorite chair. He reached for an old tin box on the mantel, opening it to reveal a collection of yellowed papers and a tarnished Confederate officer's insignia. "I was young when the war started," he began, his voice taking on a distant quality. "Had a talent for mathematics and a good eye for trajectory. They put me in artillery and I found my calling. Rose through the ranks faster than most, became the youngest artillery commander in the Confederate Army." He pulled out a faded photograph showing a much younger version of himself standing proudly beside a full-sized cannon. "We did terrible things in that war. Necessary things maybe, but terrible all the same. I learned to calculate death with the precision of an accountant. How many pounds of powder, what angle of elevation, exactly where a shell needed to land to do the most damage. The room was silent as Lucas continued, each word weighted with memory. After the war, I swore I'd never use that knowledge again. Came out here to find peace, to live quietly. But I never forgot. How could I? Those skills, those calculations, they become part of you. But you used them today, Baker said softly. To protect us. Lucas nodded slowly. The difference is in the why, Tom. Back then, we fought for causes and flags and things that seemed so important at the time. Today, I fought to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. There's no glory in it, no pride, just necessity. He carefully returned the papers to their box, his hands moving with the same precision he'd shown during the battle. Violence should always be the last resort. But when it becomes necessary, it must be decisive. That's another lesson from the war. What you did today, Martha Reeves said, her voice trembling slightly. It wasn't just about fighting. You showed us that one person can make a difference, that we don't have to accept tyranny. Lucas smiled faintly. The greatest victory isn't in defeating an enemy, Mrs. Reeves. It's in showing others that the enemy can be defeated. Fear loses its power when people stop believing in it. As twilight deepened outside, Lucas shared more stories of his past. Not the glorified tales of battle that some veterans told, but honest reflections on the cost of war and the price of peace. He spoke of comrades lost, of decisions that haunted him, and of his hope that the skills he'd learned in destruction could sometimes be used for protection. Because heroes aren't the ones who seek battle. They're the ones who survive it. Word of the Red Smoke Gang's defeat spread like wildfire across the territory. Within days, federal marshals arrived in Millbrook, drawn by reports of the gang's dramatic downfall. They found Cyrus McGraw still in Sheriff Baker's custody, his legendary bravado replaced by a haunted look that appeared whenever Lucas Stanton's name was mentioned. Never seen anything like it, McGraw told the marshals during his interrogation, his voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't just fighting us, he was playing with us. Every move we made, he'd already planned for. It was like he could see inside our minds. The marshals were skeptical at first, but the evidence scattered across Lucas's property told a compelling story. The precise placement of defensive positions, the carefully calculated fields of fire, the ingenious use of terrain. It all spoke of military expertise far beyond what they'd expected to find in a small western town. Your reputation is finished, McGraw, Marshal James Harrison informed him as they prepared to transfer him to federal custody. Every two-bit gunslinger and wannabe outlaw from here to Mexico knows how an old artillery officer took down the mighty Red Smoke Gang. Ain't nobody gonna fear your name anymore. McGraw slumped in his cell, the truth of those words hitting harder than any physical blow. His remaining gang members had scattered to the winds, many turning themselves into local authorities rather than risk crossing paths with Lucas Stanton again. You want to know the worst part? McGraw said suddenly, stopping the marshal as he turned to leave. He could have killed us all, had every chance, every right to do it. But he didn't. He broke us instead, showed everybody that we weren't nothing but cowards playing at being bad men. The marshals spent days gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and documenting the gang's crimes across 3 territories. What emerged was a pattern of terror that had finally met its match in the most unlikely of opponents. Your friend, Mr. Stanton, Marshal Harrison told Sheriff Baker as they finished the paperwork. He didn't just stop a gang. He dismantled an entire criminal empire. We're finding Red Smoke members turning themselves in all across the frontier, hoping to cut deals before their former comrades can talk first. Baker nodded, unsurprised. Lucas has that effect on people, makes them rethink their choices. As McGraw and the captured gang members were led away in chains, the marshal paused one last time. You know, we could use someone like Stanton in the service. Man with his skills, his experience. He's done enough, Baker replied firmly. Let him have his peace. The federal wagons rolled out of town, carrying with them the remnants of the once feared Red Smoke Gang. Their reign of terror was over, ended not by an army of lawmen, but by one old soldier who remembered that true strength lies not in causing fear, but in standing against it. In the weeks that followed McGraw's departure, Millbrook underwent a transformation. The fear that had gripped the town for so long gave way to a new sense of purpose and community. Under Sheriff Baker's guidance, the townspeople established a community watch, with veterans and civilians working together to ensure their streets remained safe. Lucas's property, once scarred by battle, began to heal. The townspeople came together to help him rebuild his barn, making it stronger than before. During the construction, Lucas would sometimes share small lessons in strategy and defense, teaching them how to protect what they'd built without relying on force alone. "See how the windows are positioned?" he explained to a group of eager listeners. "It's not just about having a good view. It's about controlling access, about making sure you can see trouble coming before it sees you." Sheriff Baker approached Lucas one sunny morning as he supervised the barn raising. "Got a proposition for you," he said, watching the volunteers work. "Town council's approved funding for 2 new deputy positions. One of them could be yours if you want it." Lucas smiled but shook his head. "Appreciate the offer, Tom, but my fighting days are behind me. I'll help train your deputies if you like. Teach them what I know about strategy and observation. But the badge belongs on young shoulders." "Figured you'd say that," Baker replied with a knowing grin. "But I had to ask. These folks look up to you, you know. You've given them something more valuable than protection. You've given them confidence." The town's recovery wasn't just physical. Businesses that had been struggling under the gang's extortion began to flourish. New settlers, attracted by stories of the town that stood up to the Red Smoke Gang, began arriving. Millbrook was growing, strengthened by its triumph over adversity. Mrs. Henderson's general store became a gathering place where people would share stories about the battle. Though the tales grew taller with each telling, Lucas never corrected them. He understood the importance of legends in building community spirit. "The truth is," he told Baker one evening as they watched the sunset from his porch, "what happened here isn't about me. It's about what people can do when they stop being afraid. I just reminded them of something they already knew, that standing together is stronger than standing alone." Baker nodded, understanding the deeper wisdom in Lucas's words. "Will you stay with us?" he asked. "Now that things are peaceful?" Lucas gazed out at the horizon, his expression thoughtful. "This is home now," he said simply. "And if trouble comes again, well, I made a promise to protect what matters. I aim to keep it." The sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the rebuilt barn and the thriving town beyond. Millbrook had changed, and so had its people. They had learned that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about facing fear and standing firm anyway. Years passed, and the legend of Lucas Stanton and his stand against the Red Smoke Gang became part of frontier folklore. Around campfires and in saloons across the territory, people would tell the tale of the old artillery officer who turned a gang's own confidence into their undoing. With each telling, the story grew, but its core truth remained unchanged. One person's courage could inspire an entire community. On warm evenings, Lucas could often be found on his porch, surrounded by the town's children. They would beg him to tell stories, not of the battle, but of the principles behind it, the importance of preparation, the power of knowledge, and the true meaning of strength. "Mr. Stanton," young Tommy Baker, the sheriff's son, asked one day, "could you teach me about the cannon? Pa says you were the best artillery officer in the whole Confederate Army." Lucas studied the boy thoughtfully. In his eager face, he saw the same curiosity that had driven him as a young man. "Tell you what, Tommy, before you learn about cannons, let me teach you about something more important, how to decide when not to use them." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, smooth cannonball, worn by time and handling. It was the last one from that fateful day, kept not as a reminder of victory, but as a symbol of responsibility. "This," he said, placing it in Tommy's hands, is more than just iron. It's a choice. Every time you think about using force, you have to weigh the consequences. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't fighting, it's finding another way. The town had grown prosperous and peaceful. New buildings rose where the Red Smoke Gang had once terrorized merchants. The community watch Lucas had helped train became a model for other frontier towns, emphasizing prevention and preparation over confrontation. Sheriff Baker, his hair now graying at the temples, still consulted Lucas on matters of strategy. Together, they had created a system of mutual support between neighboring communities, ensuring that no gang could ever again gain the foothold the Red Smoke Gang had enjoyed. "You know what amazes me?" Baker said one evening, sharing a quiet drink with his old friend. "It's not just what you did that day. It's what you taught us all, about standing together, about using our minds before our guns." Lucas nodded, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "That's the real victory, Tom. Not defeating enemies, but building something worth protecting." As twilight deepened into night, the sound of children's laughter echoed through the streets of Millbrook. Parents no longer hurried them inside at dusk, and businesses stayed open late without fear. The town had found its strength, not in weapons or walls, but in the unity and wisdom that Lucas had helped instill. Some legends fade with time, their lessons lost to history. But others, like the story of Lucas Stanton and his last battle, grow stronger with each telling. They remind us that true courage isn't found in the roar of cannons or the thunder of guns, but in the quiet determination to stand up for what's right, no matter the odds. Because some legends, like the echo of distant artillery, live on forever. If you enjoyed this incredible story of courage and justice, make sure to hit that subscribe button right now, because we've got more amazing tales that will leave you speechless. And tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you were in Lucas's position? Let us know your thoughts below, and we'll see you in the next video.